Alright, welcome everybody. This is going to be an exciting lecture, I can already tell. The coagulation cascade is typically pretty scary to a lot of people. The coagulation cascade doesn't make sense. The order doesn't make sense. And if you're like me, it hasn't been presented to me in a very good way. So that's why I made this video. I'm trying to make it so not so you can write the whole cascade out from top to bottom in order on your first time. That's not my goal. My goal is to get you to understand why the cascade works. Well, I will cover the whole cascade and the basics. I'll leave out some of the cofactors, so note that I'm not including the whole cascade because I can't write out the whole cascade. It would take forever. Plus my writing space isn't enough. I am going to hit all the important factors, so all the factors that are going to be involved in the intrinsic versus the extrinsic pathway. So you've got an intrinsic, you've got an extrinsic, and then finally we've got a common pathway. So there's three kind of like separate pathways that all come together eventually into that, or two separate pathways that come into the common pathway, and we're going to talk about all those. But let's talk about why we call it the coagulation cascade to begin. Coagulation cascade. We take a factor that's going to be inactivated. So I'll write inactivated factor, and we're going to turn that factor into its active form. That's all we're doing, is we're taking an inactive factor to begin and turning it into its active form. So an active factor. And to do that, we're going to use proteases. And typically, an active factor can act as a protease. So we're going to take an inactive factor, activate it, and this active factor can act as a protease to downstream events. And what that does is it allows this to cleave a whole bunch of inactive factors into active. And then what these can do is, these are also proteases, so these active factors are active, so we'll have a whole bunch of inactive ones. And we get amplification if you haven't taken it. So those can activate those. So we take one inactive factor, turn it into a protease. That protease will cleave other inactive factors, which in turn will cleave other inactive factors, so we get amplification. We're just trying to increase our cascade. We're cascading our events. So instead of having just one factor, we're having a whole bunch of factors act as proteases now. That is our goal. We're trying to cascade the pathway. And our end goal is going to be coagulation. Coagulation is going to be determined by a fibrin clot. So a fibrin clot. This is our final ultimate goal. We're trying to activate fibrin from fibrinogen, which is its inactive form. Fibrinogen is going to be inactive, into fibrin, which is going to be the active form. And then those fibrins will need to come together because they're monomer units. We need to turn it into a multimeric unit, and to do that I'll show you how. However, this is our final goal. Okay, so this is why we call it the coagulation cascade. And then we have a whole bunch of clinical tie-ins that I can throw in. We've got hemophilia type A and B, we've got vitamin deficiencies, we've got liver disease. Then I'll also talk about heparin. And possibly fibrinolytics depending on time. So we've got the intrinsic pathway that I've already alluded to. We will cover it in depth, but right now I just want you to remember that it involves factors 12, factor 11, and factor 9. So it's going to involve three separate factors. Also, you can probably throw in 8 kind of in parentheses, but remember 12, 11, 9. The intrinsic pathway, or the extrinsic pathway, my apology, is going to primarily involve factor 7. So it's a little shorter, but this is dealing with tissue damage, direct tissue damage, typically due to trauma of some sort. And then the common pathway is always going to start with factor 10. Factor 10 is going to be an important one. Then we go to factor 2. Factor 2 is also known as thrombin. Whoever invented these factors didn't do it very well because there's not a very good logical sequence of it. And then also each factor, so factor 2 is called thrombin. Each factor has its own kind of unique name. I'm really not going to go over that because that kind of takes it out of focus. And then also we've got factor 13 involved in the activation of our fibrin. So we're going to deal with the intrinsic pathway, which is going to deal with factors 12, 11, and 9. Remember, factors are simply proteases. Factors are going to act as proteases for downstream events. Keep that in mind. So now let's see if we can dive into the deep water. We're going to not drown. I'm going to teach you how to swim in this coagulation cascade. And to start, we're going to start with the intrinsic pathway. The intrinsic pathway. Remember I said it was factors 12, factors 11, factors 9, and then also you can possibly throw an 8 in there. So here is, I'm going to draw each separate pathway, then I'm going to try and draw the whole thing together. See if we can synthesize what we've learned. So we've got 12, factor 12, and it's going to be in its inactive form. When I put a little a like that, that's going to be an active factor, just for reference. So we've got factor 12, and it will get converted to its 12a form. And that'll be mediated by kallikrein. Kallikrein. Alright, so I do want to step back a second. Intrinsic. Why do we call it the intrinsic pathway? It's because we have all of these factors, factor 12, factor 11, factor 9. We have all this stuff in the blood. Our extrinsic pathway, however, doesn't have everything we need in the blood. We need tissue factor. Tissue factor. And where do we see tissue factor? We only see that when we have trauma, when our blood vessels get traumatized. When we have trauma, it introduces tissue factor, and then we can begin. So that's why they call it the intrinsic versus the extrinsic pathway. For the intrinsic pathway, we have everything we need. We have all of our materials in the blood already. However, for the extrinsic pathway, we need trauma. We need trauma. And then that'll give us tissue factor, and then once we have that tissue factor, then we can begin. So let's get rid of that, because we're not talking about the extrinsic. I just wanted you to know why we're actually calling it the intrinsic pathway. So we've got factor 12, and it's going to be inactive. It'll get converted to its active form, kallikrein. So like I said, then this active 12 can cleave a whole bunch of 11s into its 11A active form. So this one molecule of 12A will cleave multiple inactive 11 factor 11s into their active forms, and then this factor 11 will eventually do factor 9 into its 9A. Great. So 9A is going to be the last modality of our intrinsic factor pathway. However, there is of note, remember I said factor 8 could kind of be in parentheses. Factor 8 gets converted to 8A separately. Well, 8A is associated with the disease, and that's going to be associated with hemophilia. While factor 9 is going to be hemophilia type B, this will be hemophilia type A. I'll go over that in a little bit. However, just note that factor 9 will activate factor 10. I'm going to go back. Factor 10 here, factor 10 is our first factor of the common pathway. So what we'll do is we'll have extrinsic, we'll have intrinsic, they'll both meet, they'll start at 10, and then from there we'll go from 10 to 2 to 13, and so on. However, 9 is going to be the last step before we activate that factor 10. So here, 9 is going to be the last step before we activate our factor 10. And factor 10 will then get converted into its 10A, and then so on, so down, the common pathway. To activate factor 10, 9A and 8A will need to be present. Also, you'll need a couple other cofactors. However, I'm not going to throw that in. That's too much information at this point. So factor 9A and 8A will both be needed to convert factor 10 to 10A. So remember, it's a cascade. We're starting with one protease. That one protease might activate 3 11s. So now we have 3 active proteases. Each of those will activate 3 9s. So that'll be 9 proteases active. This 8A will also contribute to factor 10. So we're cascading. We're getting an amplified effect. So this is going to be the intrinsic pathway. We've got 12. We've got 11. We've got 9. And then we've got 8. Kind of the oddball out. But important nonetheless, because there is a clinical correlate. And then we've also got a whole bunch of cofactors. So cofactors are molecules that may also be required. So 11A may also need some cofactors to activate 9 into further stuff. Not going to cover it. So this is going to be the intrinsic pathway. Now I'm going to talk about the extrinsic pathway. Remember, I said we need trauma, we need tissue factor. So what's going to happen? Well, we have extrinsic pathway 1, 7. Pretty easy, right? Well, if it was easy, I wouldn't be making this video. So we've got factor 7, and that's going to be inactive. It's going to convert to its active form through tissue factor. This is from trauma. Tissue factor from trauma. We don't have it in the bloodstream to begin with. We need trauma for it to happen. Then we get the tissue factor. Then we have this active 7A form. And this active 7A slash tissue factor complex will eventually go on to convert 10 to 10A. So this is needed for the 10 to 10A conversion. And like I said, 10 is our common pathway beginning. That's it. That was pretty easy. So let's begin with our common. So our common pathway starts with 10. We've already gone from 10 to 10A. So we're going to start with 10A because remember 9A plus 8A can activate 10A, or the 7A plus the tissue factor complex can activate this 10A. So we're going to start with 10A. We have a 10A factor that is going to act as a protease, and it's going to convert 2 to 2A. Remember 2 is going to be thrombin. So we've got prothrombin is going to be our inactive. Prothrombin is going to be our inactive form, while thrombin will be our 2A. So our active form is going to be called thrombin. Our inactive form is going to be called prothrombin. And this is really the only name that I'm gonna kind of harp on. So we've got our prothrombin gets converted into thrombin. That 2A, that thrombin, is going to convert fibrinogen into fibrin. And then I'm going to write mono, because it's going to be a fibrin monomer. And to form a fibrin clot, we're going to need fibrin polymer. We're going to need to have a multimeric fibrin. We're going to need multiple fibrin molecules to make that fibrin meshwork. To make a meshwork, you don't just take one piece of string. You take multiple pieces of string and you kind of weave them together to form a fibrin mesh, to form a fibrin clot. That is our goal. Because remember, I'm going to go back here, keep our goal in mind. We're trying to form a fibrin clot, also known as like a fibrin meshwork. And you can't form a fibrin meshwork with just one string, one monomeric string. You need multiple strings. So how do we convert this fibrin monomer into fibrin polymer? So like a multimeric fibrin. Well, to do that, what we're going to need is we're going to need factor 13. So we're going to have 13. It will get converted into 13A, and 13A is going to polymerize. It's going to cross-link a whole bunch of fibrin monomers, and the cross-linkage is going to cause a fibrin polymer meshwork. And then thus, we get our fibrin clot. This fibrin polymer is our ultimate clot. So we did all that work just to activate some fibrin. We get a coagulation. That is our goal, the coagulation cascade. So we have all these different steps that we're going to be using to create this fibrin meshwork. Let's talk about some clinical some clinical tie-ins now. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit further before we talk about the tie-ins, because once we've formed our clot, we've got our fibrin clot. That was our fibrin polymer. Remember, 13 was required to put those monomers together, kind of like the Lego blocks. You stack a whole bunch of Lego blocks together, you finally get your polymer, your Lego polymer. That's going to be your fibrin clot. This gets eventually broken down. We don't want our fibrin clot to last forever. So how are we going to have our fibrin breakdown? Well, we need something called a fibrinolytic. Dealing with fibrin, lytic meaning breaking it down. So what kind of fibrinolytic are we going to use? We're going to use plasminogen converted into plasmin. Plasmin is going to be our ultimate fibrinolytic. So plasminogen gets converted into plasmin. This plasmin is going to act as a fibrinolytic, converting this fibrin clot and breaking it down. That's our ultimate goal. So I'm going to quickly throw some different color on here. So we're going to start with, oh, I don't have room, do I? So we're going to start with that breakdown. Here we go. Fibrinolytic therapy. So there's a difference between anticoagulation and fibrinolytic therapy. Two different things. For anticoagulations, we're going to prevent this fibrin clot from even happening. So we're going to stop it somewhere in the intrinsic, extrinsic, or common pathway. So that way we can't activate this fibrin clot. For fibrinolytics, we're going to activate plasmin. Our goal is to activate plasmin and break down fibrin clots. So a fibrinolytic, some of the examples will be like TPA. You may also see urokinase. Or also kind of a lesser used one, but kind of like a prototype, streptokinase. I say it's prototypical because you need a million or so units for it to be active, while TPA, you don't need that many units. Super expensive. However, streptokinase, typically don't see that anymore. You're going to see the TPA and you're going to pay out the wazoo for it. Fibrinolytic therapy. Fibrinolytics deal with plasmin. We're able to form that fibrin clot, but our goal is to break down, to lyse that clot. And then thus we'll get the fibrin breakdown products. Anticoagulatives instead are going to be used to not clot in the first place. We don't want that fibrin clot, so we're going to stop it before it gets to that fibrin clot. So we're not able to actually make this fibrin clot. Anticoagulation. So what are some of the anticoagulatives? Well, some of the main ones are going to be the coumarins, and then the heparins. So heparin is going to be a major anticoagulative. You'll also have direct factor 10 inhibitors. You'll also have direct factor 2 inhibitors. There are more. These are some of the main ones that I just wanted to point out. So anticoagulatives are going to be your coumarins. So it'll be your heparins. It'll be your direct 10I inhibitors and your direct factor 2 inhibitors. So let's keep this going. Gonna go back. TPA. This is small t. This is a large P and a large A. It's going to activate that plasminogen into plasmin, and thus you get the fibrin breakdown. I just wanted that for completeness. Alright, so let's talk about some clinical tie-ins. Hemophilia. So we've got subtype A and we've got subtype B. I've already said that A is a factor 8 deficiency. So factor 8 deficiency. So if we're not able to create factor 8, that 8/9, so I think it's this one, that 8/9 factor that's needed to convert 10 to 10A cannot happen. So if we're missing this, we can't get active 8A, therefore we can't activate 10 as well. If we're missing factor 9A, same thing. So hemophilia B is going to be a factor 9 deficiency. So factor A, hemophilia A, factor 8 deficiency. You're going to measure it, and you're going to see an increased PTT. What does PTT stand for? It's a way to measure. So there's a thing called PT and PTT. Simply said, PTT measures your intrinsic pathway, while PT measures your extrinsic. So I'm going to write that in. PTT. And if you have a common pathway, it'll be PTT/PT. I don't know what PT pathway. So keep that in mind. Maybe I'll touch on that in a little bit if we have time again. So we've got hemophilia A. You'll see an increased PTT time, the prothrombin time. You'll also see an increased, you'll also see bleeding time that's going to be normal. Bleeding time is going to be normal. It's not going to be a platelet issue. What you're going to see, though, is you're going to see normal platelet levels. So that's going to give you your normal bleeding time. The normal platelet levels will be indicative of hemophilia A. So how do you treat hemophilia A? Well, you're going to give factors 8. You're going to give the patient factor 8, and then they'll be normal or normal-ish as long as they keep taking this factor 8 to replace their deficiency. And then that 8 can get converted to 8A, and then they can coagulate normally. Factor 9, all I really wanted to say is it's known as Christmas tree disease, factor 9 deficiency, hemophilia B. Let's get to a new one. So what does protein C? Protein C. What does protein C do? Protein C will inactivate factor 5A and factor 8A. So factor 8A, this is our big one. Don't really care much about 5A. It'll inactivate factor 8A. When you can't do that, you'll see you won't coagulate as well. So if you inactivate factor 8A, it can't activate factor 10, and you don't coagulate as well. So protein C, that's just the function of protein C. Now let's talk about vitamin K deficiency. Vitamin K deficiency. Well, why are we talking about a nutritional deficiency? It's because there's a drug called Coumadin, so the coumarin subtype. Drug Coumadin is going to bind vitamin K. It's going to take up a whole bunch of vitamin K. Well, what's important about that? Well, you have a whole bunch of factors that are going to be vitamin K dependent. You may have heard this before. Vitamin K dependent. They're going to be your factor 2, factor 7, factor 9, and factor 10. Factor 2, 7, 9, and 10. Commit that to memory. That's come up on multiple tests I've taken. Vitamin K dependent factors. So these factors are going to need vitamin K as a cofactor to work. Like I said, cofactors come into play now. So vitamin K. So coumarin is going to bind up all that vitamin K. So these 4 factors don't work as well. 10 is involved in that common pathway. 2 is involved in that common pathway. 7 is the extrinsic. 9 is the intrinsic. So multiple places on this cascade are vitamin K dependent, and these factors will not work if they don't have vitamin K. So also protein C and protein S are also required with vitamin K to work. So 2, 7, 9, 10, CS. What will you see with vitamin K deficiency? Well, you will see PT increase to begin. You want normal PT and PTT are both low. So PT and PTT are both low. That's normal. It's like a golf score. If they're increased, like a basketball score, you know something's wrong. So extrinsic, intrinsic, common. What is the difference? Well, our PT and our PTT, the intrinsic is the longer pathway. Remember, it had 12, 11, 9, and then it finally activated 10. This one was just factor 7, so it was really short. PT is a short name. PTT is a long name. So this long pathway has a long measurement. This short pathway has a short measurement. Just remember it that way. PT measures the intrinsic pathway. PTT measures extrinsic pathway. PTT measures the intrinsic pathway through the common pathway as well. So if you have a common pathway problem, both of these will be elevated. They'll be abnormal. You don't want a high golf score. That's bad. However, if it's just one of these, so if the PT is elevated, you know it's something in the external pathway that's wrong. So factor 7 problem. So in this vitamin K deficiency, you'll see a PT increase first. Why do I say you'll see a PT increase first? You will eventually see an increased PTT as well. However, if you bind up all the factor 7 through vitamin K deficiency, so you bind up all the vitamin K, you're going to have a factor 7 deficiency. You're going to see an increased PT first because this is a short pathway. If you have not enough factor 7, you're going to have a problem. And that's going to be manifested first. You'll eventually see an increased PTT. So vitamin K deficiency, an increased PT first. That's about all I want to say with this. Also, you may see, instead of, where's my mouse? Instead of coumarin binding vitamin K, you may also hear it as patient has been taking antibiotics. Antibiotics. They've been taking antibiotics for the last 7 days for their bacterial infection, and they've been taking high-powered antibiotics. Vitamin K can be synthesized by your gut flora. If you wipe out your gut flora through an antibiotic regimen, you may have a vitamin K deficiency, and then you'll get the exact same thing. You'll have an increased PT initially, then later on you'll have an increased PTT. You're not able to coagulate as well. Your platelets will be fine, but you won't be able to coagulate as well. Alright, so beating that one to death. Now let's talk about liver disease. Liver disease. If you're still watching, great. Probably lost half of you by now because we're kind of venturing into the more boring stuff. One thing I do want to point out that I just popped into my mind, both of these, PT and PTT, don't measure factor 13. They don't measure factor 13. So keep that in mind. They'll measure everything else. They'll measure everything else in the pathway, but they won't measure factor 13. So now let's talk about liver disease. We'll see this in like cirrhosis. Cirrhosis, our liver's not going to function normally. What does it matter? It's because our factors are synthesized in liver. That's an important point. Our factors are synthesized in the liver. So if you have liver disease, if our liver's not working as well due to cirrhosis, we're not able to synthesize factors. We will not coagulate as well. So we're going to run out of factors. Again, PT is going to be most sensitive because through that extrinsic pathway, we just have that factor 7 instead of having 12, 11, and 9. If we run out of factors, we'll see it first through running out of factor 7, so we'll have an increased PT first. Later on, we'll have an increased PTT. So that's kind of the progression as it goes. So we've covered the difference between fibrinolytics and anticoagulants. We've talked about vitamin K deficiency. We've talked about hemophilia. We've talked about the PT-PTT pathway slightly. We've talked about liver disease. Now let's talk about heparin. Heparin and antithrombin. I keep adding in new terms as we go. Hopefully some of it's sticking. Hopefully you're conceptually learning. You might not know it all. You might not be able to spit it back. However, hopefully you're kind of piecing it together in your mind in a logical sequence. So let's talk about antithrombin to begin. Antithrombin, it's going to inactivate factors. Let's take a look at its name first. Antithrombin. Antithrombin. Let me see if I can find common pathway. Where is it? There it is. Remember I said factor 2 was called thrombin? I guess factor 2 is called prothrombin. 2 active form is called thrombin. So we're talking about a molecule that's called antithrombin. What do you think antithrombin is going to do? It's going to say, hiya. It's going to karate chop factor 2. So that's going to be antithrombin. It's going to inactivate factor 2. Antithrombin. Thrombin is also known as factor 2. Okay, so that's where its name comes from. It's going to inactivate factor 2A. It's also going to inactivate some other stuff like 10A and then etc. However, these are the two stuff I want to start. Factor 2A and 10A. These are the two main ones. So that's antithrombin function. What does heparin do? So why am I saying heparin plus antithrombin? Well, heparin makes antithrombin on steroids. Antithrombin works just fine. It will inactivate factors, but it doesn't do it very efficiently. When you throw some heparin into the system, it turns antithrombin into a muscle builder. It will be strong. It'll work very well. It'll put it on steroids. So what it does is heparin activates antithrombin activity. Top 10 point of this lecture. Heparin activates antithrombin activity. Antithrombin still works normally without heparin, but when you throw heparin drug into the system, it'll make this antithrombin really well. So what does that do? Well, it'll inactivate factors. We'll get rid of factor 2. Remember, factor 2 is in the common pathway. It'll inactivate factor 10. What was factor 10? It was in the common pathway. We're going to block coagulation. We're going to block coagulation. So what it is this is going to be an anticoagulant medication. Heparin is going to be an anticoagulant. I'm going to go back, see if I can find it. Heparin, anticoagulant. Remember, it's not a fibrinolytic. The clot isn't going to form. We're not going to have to break it down. It's because we're not going to let the clot even form to begin with. It's an anticoagulant. Same with coumarins. We've already talked about Coumadin. Coumadin bound vitamin K. It has a vitamin K deficiency. You're not able to form that clotting cascade because some of those factors are vitamin K dependent. So coumarins are also anticoagulants. Also, you can have a direct 10 inhibitor. We can just straight out knock out factor 10. Instead of heparin amps up the antithrombin activity, which will knock out 2 and 10, etc. Or you could just knock factor 10 out initially through a direct inhibitor. So heparin activates antithrombin activity. That's a big point to remember. So lastly, I'm going to talk about the difference between heparins. So you may have heard low molecular weight heparin, and you may have heard unfractionated heparin. So what is the difference? Well, low molecular weight heparin is going to be made up of short chain polysaccharides, while unfractionated heparin will contain some long chain polysaccharides. It'll contain some short, it'll contain some medium. Unfractionated means it just contains the gamut of the chains, while low molecular weight heparins contain short chains only. So what do I mean by this? Well, the average weight or the size of this molecule is going to be 4.5 kilodaltons, while the average size of this is going to be about 15 kilodaltons. So this is almost 4 times larger on average than a low molecular weight heparin. So we're talking about size. That's really all that it is. We're talking about low size or a big size. So for low molecular weight heparins, you don't need PTT time. You don't need PTT time. However, for unfractionated, you need to monitor the patient with PTT. So that's the difference. You have a decreased risk of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. I'm just going to abbreviate HIT. Heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. Also, you have a way to measure it. You don't use the PTT. You can use an anti-factor 10 assay to monitor it. Not as important to remember. Just remember, if you have unfractionated, you need to monitor the PTT time because you don't want it to elevate too high. You don't want them to be able to bleed, or not to let me back up. You don't want them to not be able to coagulate very well. Sorry for the terminology there. Also, low molecular weight heparin, it doesn't bind to plasma proteins as much. So, plasma proteins, let's say albumin, for example. Albumin's floating around in the bloodstream, it'll bind stuff. You don't want it to bind the heparin because when it's bound, it's not active. When you bind a protein, it'll inactivate that heparin for a time being. So if you have a whole bunch of proteins in your system and you give a shot of heparin and it binds a lot, you're not going to have much effect because the bound heparin doesn't work. Low molecular weight heparin doesn't bind proteins as well. So you're gonna have a better expected response. You're not gonna have that variable of will it bind protein, will it not? You won't have that question mark. So that way you don't have to monitor the PTT as well. But since unfractionated heparin binds well to proteins, you need to monitor that PTT to make sure your dosing's correct because you have that variable of protein binding that you just can't take into account for. Low molecular weight heparins have an increased half-life. So they have an increased half-life, they'll last longer, they work better. Low molecular weight heparins are better in most situations. However, they may be a little more expensive, and this unfractionated was there to begin with. So let's talk about unfractionated a little more. You can reverse unfractionated. It's hard to reverse low molecular weight heparins. So unfractionated, if you're in a patient that you need to monitor very closely and may need to reverse it if possible, you'd probably use an unfractionated because you can reverse it with protamine sulfate. Protamine sulfate is going to block the heparin, and then when you block the heparin, it's not going to work, so your antithrombin activity isn't going to be amped up on steroids. Okay, so you're going to have dosing problems with this, monitor PTT. That's probably a top 10, no, that's probably a top 20 from this lecture. Don't give it too much credit. Then let's talk about this thing called, here it is, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. Okay, well let's take a look at the name first. So we've got thrombocytopenia. It's just going to be a decreased platelet count. That's all that means. Penia means decreased, thrombocyte, platelet. So we're going to have decreased platelets, going to be caused by heparin. So normally we'll have normal platelet levels. However, when we give heparin, we're going to decrease our platelet levels. That's what it simply means. So what is it? Well, we're going to have a common presentation of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So we'll have decreased platelets, also known as thrombocytopenia. Platelets. Struggling with spelling today. We're also going to see Coagulability. We're going to see hypercoagulability because platelets are going to become active. Normally we have normal platelet levels. When we have heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, we're going to have decreased platelet levels. What's going to happen to all those normal platelets? Well, they're going to coagulate. We're going to coagulate them. So when we coagulate those platelets, we're going to lose our free platelet count in our bloodstream. That's why we lose our platelet count, is because they're becoming activated. Those platelets will form a clot. Those platelets will form the clot. That's bad. So how do we get this? Well, we have antibodies against heparin in the form of IgG. Remember, there's different subtypes, 5 different subtypes. Well, we're going to be talking about IgG antibodies, specifically antibodies that the body makes against the drug heparin. That's not good. Our body shouldn't be making antibodies against heparin. However, some people, it does happen. And when this happens, the platelets, these antibodies will bind platelet factor 4. So these antibodies against heparin will bind platelet factor 4. So we have this platelet factor 4. So antibodies plus this heparin platelet factor 4 complex. So we have this massive complex that's made of antibodies, heparin, and platelet factor 4. These are going to activate platelets. This right here are going to activate platelets. When we get activated platelets, we're going to form a clot. When we have activated platelets that form a clot, we're going to decrease our platelet count. We're going to get thrombocytopenia. We're also going to have that hypercoagulability. So this is why it happens. We have antibodies against heparin. It's going to bind platelet factor 4. This large complex made of these 3 are going to activate the platelets that are normal in the body. What you're going to do is you're just going to treat it. You're going to stop the heparin, of course. You're just going to treat it with a different anticoagulant. Remember, I said there were a whole bunch of different anticoagulants. You could have the coumarins, you could have the direct 10I inhibitors, you could have the direct 2 inhibitors as well. So just treat with alternative means. Don't give heparin in the future if they have heparin-induced thrombocytopenia because they have antibodies against heparin. Not good. So hopefully you found this useful. Maybe you learned something at some point. Hopefully you can take an away message. The whole cascade, maybe before I wrap things up, I'm going to draw the whole thing out from top to bottom, just so you can see the big picture, because I like big pictures. So we've got 12 goes to 12A. We've got 11 goes to 11A. We've got factor 9 goes to 9A. We've got factor 8. I'll throw that in here, 8A. Remember, 8 goes to 8A. Factor 9A and factor 8A will both combine to give you 10 to 10A. However, this is the intrinsic pathway. You've also got the extrinsic pathway, 7 to 7A, and that's going to be through tissue factor. So this 7A / tissue factor complex will also do the same thing. It'll also do the same thing. So we have 10 to 10A. 10 to 10A will make factor 2 to 2A active. 2 is also known as prothrombin. So our active form is going to be called just thrombin. Thrombin converts fibrinogen into fibrin. That fibrin is going to be in a monomeric form. We need to somehow cross-link, so we're going to use factor 13. So we're going to have an active 13A. So we're going to have these cross-linkage, this multimer now. So we've got a fibrin clot. So we've got this fibrin clot. Great. How are we going to break it down? Well, we're going to break it down through plasminogen. That's going to turn into plasmin. Plasmin is going to break down this fibrin clot. We've got TPA. TPA is going to convert plasminogen into plasmin. We've got antibiotics slash coumarin. That's going to bind your vitamin K. The vitamin K is going to be 2, 7, 9, 10, protein C, protein S. You've got heparin. Heparin is going to amp up antithrombin. Antithrombin is going to cut out factors 2 and 10 right there. When you do that, you can't bleed as well. Those are going to be anticoagulants. You're going to measure this intrinsic pathway on this side via PTT. You're going to measure the extrinsic common pathway via PT. That's about a good place to leave. If you have any questions, be sure to ask in the comments section, or if you have any comments in general for this video. I always enjoy getting comments. Please like if you found this video useful, or if you learned something. It builds my ego up. And subscribe for more videos. Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me your time today.